Charlie is one of our iwill ambassadors. Do you want to briefly introduce yourself, Charlie?
Yeah, I'm Charlie, and I'll be doing a talk about disability and social action and social media in a bit.
Awesome, thank you. We've got Dr. Stuart Fox. Stu, do you want to briefly?
Hi, yes. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Stuart Fox. I'm a lecturer in British politics at Brunel University, London. I know a fair few of you, and I've exchanged emails with you over the past year or so, and I'm very grateful that you're able to join us. And as you probably guessed, I do research into young people's political engagement, and at the moment that involves research into young people's volunteering and social action.
Fantastic. And then our other speaker today is Jo. Do you want to introduce yourself, Jo?
Hi everyone, I'm Jo. I'm a social entrepreneur currently studying at the University of Oxford, and I'll be talking about youth social action through entrepreneurship. So hi there everyone, I hope you're all good. I'll admit when I first signed on to deliver this presentation, I would not have imagined that we'd find ourselves in this situation, but here we are and here it is, and we'll carry on and do the best that we can given the situation. Thank you so much for coming, tuning in from the comfort of your homes. To step up to serve, and iwill ambassadors for supporting me, and also to Stu for organising such a wonderful symposium and giving me the opportunity to present just a few minutes. A lot of pressure in going first because everyone has such amazing things to say, but hopefully enjoyable and worthwhile. As mentioned, my name is Joanna Baptista, and I'm an 18-year-old social entrepreneur, activist and public speaker, currently reading economics and management at the University of Oxford. This year I have the immense pleasure of being an iwill ambassador. I am now one of 300 young people across the UK, united with the common passion of making a difference. And as part of that, I found myself here speaking to you all about my take on youth social action. I might not have years of experience and academic background behind me, but I do, as a young person, happen to understand young people really quite well. So what actually makes a young person a young person? You can see some of the statistics on the presentation, but we have an average attention span of 7 seconds, which means that any young person currently tuning in has already lost their attention on me and is not thinking about me anymore. We're 25% of the population, and we're also one of the most socially conscious generation ever. 44% of us claim to check our phone hourly, although I imagine, given the current situation, that's probably a lot more of us at the moment. I've been trying to run my own business since the days of wanting to buy matcha attacks when my parents wouldn't give me the money for them. I tried selling homemade jams, made bracelets in the school playground, and sold my old key rings to friends. But at the age of 12, I entered an adult business competition with the idea of an Internet of Things toothbrush to improve the brushing techniques for young children, and somehow ended up winning. For the prize, we were offered the chance to pitch our business to real investors for real money. And I don't think I quite understood that at age 12, but nonetheless, I thought I was about to become a multi-millionaire and help change the world at the same time. And whilst that didn't quite happen, it was the start of a pretty non-traditional extracurricular pastime for someone my age, and allowed me to explore my passion for helping other young people. I founded She.Dot, my current social enterprise, 2 years ago, originally as a school project with my friends, who, having all experienced prejudice in our everyday lives, decided that we wanted to do something about it. Unfortunately, prejudice is all too common, and I'm sure a fair share of you can say you've experienced the same thing, whether it was people in your ice hockey team telling you to just quit and go back to the kitchen, or like my friend being thrown eggs walking down the street just for the colour of her skin. And that's how She.Dot was born, on a mission to reverse social prejudices through a series of children's picture books, which take classic fairy tales and rewrite them with a modern twist, in order to highlight themes such as homophobia, sexism, racism, disability discrimination, as well as more, in a subtle yet impactful way. Think like The Princess and the Frog, but the frog turns into a princess, or Rapunzel, but the girl knight saves a boy Rapunzel, or Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, who each represent different physical and mental disabilities. The books are available in 6 languages, available in physical and ebook versions, and have reached over 15 countries in impact. They've been featured on channels such as BBC News and received endorsements from the likes of Peter Tatchell, Miriam Margolyes OBE, and Stonewall. We also run, in conjunction with the books, workshops and mentoring opportunities, predominantly for young girls from low socioeconomic backgrounds who are interested in traditionally male-dominated careers. According to the 2018 Deloitte Millennial Survey, 43% of us plan to leave our jobs in the next 2 years. Yet at the same time, there are young people doing their own thing and leading their own change. What defines the path that young people are taking is not necessarily that they're the high school dropouts who founded Apple or Facebook, but more that they're the most socially conscious generation we've ever seen, and they're taking matters into their own hands. I guess the question remains, what's the point? Why do we need social enterprise, and why do we need social action? In a world where there are so many problems, we need the active change makers to come up with innovative solutions. Entrepreneurship has the power to shape society and alleviate some of the challenges we currently face. But it's also something that needs to be successfully channeled in order to best serve our community. We can use enterprise to build a new donut store, or we can use enterprise to develop a new meatless meat that can curb the effects of climate change. And then the question of young people. And to this I simply say, why not? Entrepreneurs are problem solvers who find a cause they care about and decide to do something about it. Through social action, young people are discovering flaws and are choosing not to stick a plaster over it, but instead make a difference. Take Nadia Okamoto as an example. She's 20 years old and a current junior at Harvard University, who's also the co-founder of the largest youth-run NGO in women's health, Period, which she founded in 2014. What started as a movement to break the stigma of periods after experiencing homelessness for herself, Nadia has now developed an organisation which has served over 850,000 periods, with over 600 campus chapters delivering their work on a local level. At the same time, Nadia has written a book, run for Massachusetts City Councillor, and regularly spends a 7-day week in 10 cities on a speaking schedule that includes the Obama Foundation, Adidas, and L'Oreal. Social action opens up opportunities for young people in ways they never thought possible. Nadia launched a national not-for-profit off the back of a mission to alleviate period poverty in her local community. I found my passion for enterprise and my passion for helping people through wanting to make sure other young girls had a better chance in life than they otherwise would have. And each time one person takes on the challenge of an issue that they care about and impacts them, they inspire others to do the same and set off a chain reaction. All throughout this session, you'll hear about ways that youth social action is contributing to wider societal gains. But what exactly can we do to promote youth social action? Though there are countless ways, I thought I'd leave you with a few short suggestions of how you can play your part to set off that chain reaction towards a better future. Listen to young people and engage them in what matters to them. We have causes that we care about and we each fight different battles that we need help with. By reaching out to young people, you can help align the causes that they care about with actions that they can take and think of things that they might not have even considered before. Let's also vote with our pound. Corporates and governments should be doing more to support initiatives and young people, whether that be through grants, charities, or resources. Connect us with people you know who can act as mentors, teach us, or inspire us. We can't be what we can't see, and we certainly can't do this alone. And finally, empower us to achieve. Show us that you believe in us. Search for us and support us. Care. Give us a platform and provide us with the time and attention that is so rare. Though I'm sure there's so much more to be said, my time is short and there are others here with valuable things to say. So thank you so much for the time that you spent listening to me, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what everyone else has to say.
Hi. As Joe said, I didn't really expect to be doing this in this sort of a format, but when you hear my content, it might actually become quite ironic that this has become online. So that's cool. So I'm Charlie, I'm 19 and I'm from Birmingham, if you couldn't tell from my accent. I'm an iwill ambassador this year and I do social action surrounding disability, mental health, LGBTQ+ issues, and I also volunteer with several organisations, particularly the Scouts. I'm also a disabled student at Lancaster University and I study history and politics. So I can't imagine my life now without social action. My journey began with social media and it continues to be the centre of my work. So I've been using Twitter to speak out about injustices since I was about 13 and blogging on and off for even longer. Notably, I wrote an open letter to Michael Gove back in 2013, which was published in the Huffington Post about the then new English GCSE. I couldn't read it now without cringing massively, but it was very empowering to me at the time. And it really, really set off my journey. As a disabled young person, social media is more than a platform for selfies and likes. Not that there's anything wrong with that, and I'm certainly not implying that I don't take selfies. But for me, it's a lifeline, and it's a way for me to connect to the world of social action. It gives me a community and the ability to keep up with the rest of the world if I'm stuck in my bed. It's only been in the last year that I've gained a lot of my mobility back, And even now I find protests and strikes difficult. Standing for long periods of time or walking long routes can cause me to flare of my chronic pain and fatigue for quite a few days. And the anxiety of that, along with crowds of people, can cause me significant issues. Maybe digital activism can be argued as less valid or less effective, but for young disabled people, it's one of the best ways for us to be involved. Billions of people are using social media every single day, so why can't it be seen as effective as a march? Social media activism has taught me about so many causes that I might not ever have heard about in traditional media. I remember watching the Ferguson protests unfold. I campaigned online during the Brexit referendum, even though, or arguably because, I wasn't old enough to vote. I've stayed up watching and live tweeting multiple elections. I've supported Me Too, Never Again, Fridays for Future. Social media activism is the present and the future, and part of its importance is in its multiple roles as an archive, as a live stream, a place to meet friends and to debate those you might not otherwise have access to. In a recent lecture that I had that mentioned digital activism, my lecturer was mildly scathing about its efficiency. There was a lot of discussion about Slacktivism and whether changing your profile photo or signing an e-petition can really have any effect. But the effect of hashtags that attract millions of thoughts and often cause big news pieces or in-person marches has to be seen as effective. And you never know who one simple action might reach, causing them to become an activist for years later. After being slightly fired up by this lecture, I wrote an essay on the topic, and I came across a quote by one academic. It is one angry tweet sent out late at night that leads to thousands in the streets the next day. That's McLennan 2018. And I think it's so true, and I'm really inspired by that idea. But along with social media, it's volunteering that puts fire in my belly and really sees me at my happiest. The two combined have led to my belief that every young person should be using their voice and their right to democracy. So as I mentioned before, I've volunteered with several organisations, the primary one being the Scouts. I've been volunteering with my group for 4 years, and I work with the 8 to 10 age group, the Cub Scouts. Teaching them about things ranging from cooking and science all the way to disability awareness and democracy for UK Parliament Week makes me feel like I'm really having an impact on their growth and general awareness of the world. I think teaching and encouraging social action in the young is so important and can lead to kids eventually taking part themselves, both in volunteering and in democracy. This week, social media has suddenly come to play a key part in scouting, as all face-to-face scouting has been suspended until further notice. Hundreds of scout leaders are taking to Facebook and Twitter to ask about the best ways to keep scouting virtual, and others are sharing their plans as well as activity packs and resources. I'm very lucky to be part of the Community Impact Group, and we work on the hashtag #AMillionHands campaign, which began a few years ago. It encourages scout groups to pick one of 6 themes, including mental health, homelessness, and the environment, and use our activities or their own to make a change in their community. This week, we've been working on how that can be done at home, but when we aren't affected by a major pandemic, we see groups learning how to protect the world, make their communities more cohesive, support refugees, and make their groups and wider communities more autism friendly, which is one of my personal favourites, being autistic myself. We are watching more and more scouts every single day help leave the world better than they found it, and it's so rewarding. I've also worked with a small local charity who provides stay and plays for disabled children during the holidays. Working with those kids is so fulfilling because I get to see their communication grow over 6 weeks and get to know them beyond their disabilities and needs. I also love talking to the parents and hearing out their worries that often aren't listened to. And that brings me to why I vote. I vote for so many reasons. I vote for the NHS, which has saved my life and constantly improved it, but it hasn't been without a decade of battles against the system. I love it, whilst constantly hoping it gets more funding and is improved for the next generation. I vote for every disabled person, for the accessibility that we don't currently experience. I vote for young people who deserve a world that looks better than how we have found it. My friends have had to listen to me go on about registering to vote and eventually actually voting ever since we started turning 18. During the December general election, I posted on Instagram and Snapchat almost daily in an attempt to get my friends registered to vote and then to eventually actually put a cross in the box. Politics affects every aspect of life, whether that be disability rights and equal pay, to just how much a bus ticket costs. And I don't believe that young people realise that. They say politics is boring, or that they're only one person, so their vote can't count. And that's what I want to combat. It was social media that began to teach me about social justice when I was years away from being old enough to vote. And it's what continues to remind me why I volunteer and why I have the morals that I do every single day. So in conclusion, I believe that my social action and volunteering have been imperative to both my passion for politics and my belief in democracy as one of my core values. I believe that there needs to be more of a push by sixth forms and colleges to get young people registered to vote as they turn 18 and during election campaigns. Schools don't need to be party political to encourage their pupils to put a cross in the box. As well as this, more young people need to be encouraged to volunteer, to see the role that can be made, see the change that can be made within our society, to see why their vote is so important. For me, the role that social media has played in my life and my activism is huge, and along with volunteering, my hope is that it can be used for good and get young people voting. And I do think that this is something already in progress and seen throughout the December election. Maybe I live in an echo chamber, but it's seemingly beginning to have an impact. After so many of my friends asked me for advice during the December election, I like to think more young people are thinking about their vote and seeing the true impact it can have. To me, my vote is something I will never take for granted. As a marginalised young person, it's one of the most powerful things I hold. So thank you for listening to me. I've popped my contact details on the screen if you'd like to chat with me further, and like Joe, I'll be happy to take your questions.
I had a question, Charlie, around whether you think the doing online social action, do you think that provides you with the same kind of, does it feel as meaningful as doing something in person?
I think that it depends. For a long time, I really didn't feel like I was having the impact that I would want to have. And I've definitely had imposter syndrome about it as well. But I do think that it is what kickstarted my journey, and I can't ignore that. And I also think that so many young people are using it every day that it can be just as accessible, maybe even more so. The fact that anyone can kind of access what I'm saying is great. I do think, like I say, there is the issue of echo chambers, but I think that the world's changing, and so maybe it will become sort of as effective.
There's a question here for you both, Charlie and Joe. And did you start volunteering after you became an activist? I guess it might be difficult to assess what comes first, volunteering or political participation. That's from Raj.
So for me, I've been in scouting since I was 10, but I started volunteering at 16 with them. So it was my political participation that came first with the social media side. But they are quite intrinsically linked in how they've kind of affected my beliefs and my core values. Like, I love scouting. I think it's absolutely brilliant. And my other volunteering as well has kind of followed that. So yeah, I think, yeah, I did start volunteering afterwards, but they are quite linked for me.
I'd say for me it might be the other way around. Actually, I think that volunteering is sometimes more easier to access in terms of you can volunteer on such a small scale, and when you volunteer you're usually doing something on behalf of another organization, whereas being an activist is almost taking things into your own hands, and it takes, I think, a bigger leap of faith. So volunteering can sort of be testing the waters and helping a cause that you care about, and then activism is taking that next step to, now I want to do something actively about that and I want to take my own path. So I think for me it might have been the other way around to Charlie.
Interesting, thank you. Got a question from Kimberly. In your experiences, what are the biggest barriers to young people getting involved in social action? That's to both of you as well.
I'd say for me, perhaps it's that young people just don't know about some of the youth social action that they can get involved with, or there can be very much this tendency for young people to think, oh, like, it's always when you're older, like, in the future, what do I want to do in the future? I'm going to support this. And a lot of the time they'll say, oh, now is my time that I sit and watch Netflix and learn a musical instrument and see my friends. And those are all super valuable things to be doing. But I think there's this idea that the notion that they should be worrying about these things later on in life and don't think that social action is for them at this moment. And that might be from a lack of like knowledge about the opportunities, or just going with the status quo, or being worried about what other people are going to think of them if they do, or just like, yeah, just running with the tide instead of, you know, taking a step back and thinking about moving forward with something that they care about.
Yeah, I think that for me personally, as you can probably tell, it's been my disabilities, and the community that I've seen on social media is pretty much the same. It's not always accessible. I have been very, very lucky in who I've been around in my Scout group. They've made it very accessible. Other marginalisations as well, I think, are massive. I do think there's likely still a race gap and like things like that. But like Joe says, like just not understanding what's around you and stuff. A lot of people think that if you haven't been in scouting since you were like 10 years old like me, you can't kind of go into it now, and I think that can be quite similar in different organisations. So I think there's quite a variety of reasons, but hopefully we can start pushing and getting the word out about that. Yeah,
definitely. And also continuing to work with young people to identify those solutions, I think. Got a question from Liam, which is very topical. This is about the current situation. So he says there are currently discussions about what we should be supporting young people to do during the pandemic. And we're a bit stuck between seeing lots of delivery and check-in actions locally, but with government guidance that means that we can't ask young people to do those sort of things. It puts them and others at risk. So he's asking if you've got any thoughts on what we should be encouraging now and what you think we might end up encouraging. Difficult question.
This is something I've been thinking about quite a lot because of my conditions, I am kind of social isolating. If I got the virus, it would affect me quite greatly. So I wish I could be doing more in my community that I'm seeing people doing with doing deliveries and things like that, but I can't. So it's definitely something that's been on my mind. I think that I'm trying to encourage people to kind of donate to food banks a lot. Obviously with the panic buying, there's a massive issues for food banks in that, as well as just kind of talking to people about why they're doing the actions they are, why are they not staying at home, why are they panic buying, things like that. One of the A Million Hands categories is kindness in every community and community cohesion. So I think that those sort of activities are massive, that we've been working on. But I think it's very, very difficult to want to help but kind of not having the access to that. So it's definitely something that I think is being discussed a lot. So it's a really interesting question.
I guess for me, some of the problems for young people is that not only do they want to help, but they might not be hit as much in terms of stressing about what would happen if they get ill, but there's really severe negative mental health impacts of the notion of social distancing, which are affecting everyone, but especially because young people are so used to freedom and going out and about and doing things and meeting with people, and the feeling that they now need to stay home means that they are connected through social media, but they're also restricted, especially as someone who's used to being in university and being independent and doing lots of things. That's something that's been taken away from us, and so for us we need ways to keep busy and do things, and I think that means that it's a great opportunity to be encouraging young people to do stuff for their local community. And I think, for example, FaceTiming local older or vulnerable people in their local communities, reaching out to people they know or vulnerable people. Some people are suggesting deliveries, which is true that maybe the government guidelines prevent us from doing things, but there are so many other things, such as sharing your skills, like post an online video of how to do a drawing or how to learn a musical instrument and sharing that with other young people. And even if it's them being innovators and suggesting ideas that other people can get involved, or being the people who instigate a group FaceTime with their local community or with their friends, to make sure that we're keeping the spirits up, because when your spirits up, then you're much more likely to cooperate and help out, and the time will pass quicker. And I think that's something that young people really have the opportunity to be changing.
Awesome, thank you so much both. I'm afraid we're out of time for questions, but there is another question here, so we'll get in touch with you guys afterwards and try and answer those. Now over to Dr. Stuart Fox on his research, social action as a route to the ballot box. Over to you, Stu.
Brilliant, thanks. There we are. Thank you very much, Emma, and thanks, Joe and Charlie. Those were absolutely fascinating presentations. Before I start, I just want to say a thank you again to Step Up to Serve, to Joe and Charlie in particular for being involved with today, and to everyone who's tuned in to watch it. I've really enjoyed doing this project, and I've had a chance to work with a great many people on it over the past couple of years. So I hope that you find this interesting and that we can work together again in the future. Thank you all very much. Now, after those two quite charismatic and even inspiring presentations, I'm afraid I'll bring you all back down to earth with a bump with my academic talk, but I will try to keep it as engaging as I can. My research, I guess, at the moment is focusing on young people who aren't doing what Joe and Charlie are doing, and essentially making their voices heard at least to quite the same extent. And particularly, I'm interested in voting in elections and the differences between younger people and older people in electoral turnout. It's quite difficult to remember at times, actually, particularly when we hear really fascinating presentations, as we've just heard from Joe and Charlie. But they are members of a generation who are disproportionately underrepresented when it comes to our politics, and they are disproportionately underrepresented at the ballot box in elections. Young people today are far less likely to vote than any other generation that we've ever studied in the history of social science. And this brings a whole series of problems and challenges that projects like this one are trying to solve. So what I'm going to do here is just give a quick summary of the key findings of my project, and I'm happy to take questions on the detail of it later. The project, as you can see, is social action as a route to the ballot box, and essentially what I'm looking at is whether volunteering and social action can reduce inequalities in turnout by getting more younger people to take part in elections. SARB, as I've come to call it, is a research project that's funded by the Wales Institute for Social and Economic Research, Data and Methods, or WISER, and Understanding Society. And collectively, what we're looking at is whether or not volunteering and policies and funding and campaigns that encourage and promote volunteering and social action would help reduce generational turnout decline. In other words, the growing propensity for younger people not to vote in elections. So I've been looking at two key questions, and I'm going to tell you what the answers we found to those are today. Does childhood volunteering help young people vote when they reach adulthood? In other words, when they become eligible to vote? And are the benefits of that volunteering greatest for those who are the least likely to vote when they reach adulthood, such as those who have come from poorer backgrounds? Now, I'll just start very briefly on what exactly the challenge is, what I'm talking about with generational turnout decline. Younger people have always been less likely to vote than older people, and then we tend to become more likely to vote as we get older. There's nothing unusual about that. The challenge is that since the 1970s, the gap between younger people and their elders has grown. And today's young people are less likely to vote than their parents or their grandparents were at the same age. So whereas young people become more likely to vote as they get older, they're starting from a lower level. And the problem is that voting is habitual. Those who get into the habit of voting when they are young are likely to keep voting into their adult lives. In fact, if you vote in the first 3 elections in which you are eligible to do so, there's a really high probability, around 90% probability, that you will vote in almost every other election for the rest of your adult life. If you don't get into that habit, there's a really low chance that you will vote in more than the odd election in the rest of your adult life. Now, this graph kind of illustrates that. This shows turnout in UK general elections between 1997 and 2017. We don't have the data for the 2019 election yet. And what I've done is divided the electorate into 5 generations, and these generations are characterized by the period in which people became eligible to vote, when they entered the electorate. So that turquoise line at the top, they're the oldest voters. This is the pre-post-war generation, people who became eligible to vote after the end of the war. Just beneath them is the 60s, 70s generation, sometimes known as baby boomers. Then you've got the 80s generation, then the 90s, and at the bottom is the millennial generation. So this is people born since the mid-1980s. And the key thing, as well as being able to see the pretty clear generational decline of turnout there, the key thing is that even when turnout increases across the whole electorate, as it has since 2001, we tend to see the turnout of the youngest generations continuing to lag behind their elders. So they remain disproportionately underrepresented. Perhaps what makes this even more concerning is that this is not something that affects all young people equally. Turnout decline is heavily pronounced amongst younger people coming from poorer backgrounds and who are less likely to enter higher education. And on this graph, it's the same information as on the previous graph, but I've divided our generations up into graduates and non-graduates. So here, when we look at graduates, there's basically no generational pattern. There isn't really that much of a difference. Here's the millennials, slightly lower turnout than everybody else, but well over 60% of them have voted in pretty much every election since 2005. We switch to the non-graduates though, the gap is much larger. And the gap between millennial non-graduates and millennial graduates is considerably larger than that equivalent gap for all the other generations. So as well as this problem of generational turnout decline, we have a widening socioeconomic gap. Younger people from poorer backgrounds are even less likely to vote and even more underrepresented than those from wealthier backgrounds. Why does this matter? Why is it that turnout in particular is so important? Because it's really bad for young people. We are living in a period now when differences in political preference between young and old have never been so stark. It's not just Brexit, it's tax, it's climate change, it's education policy, it's crime policy, it's foreign affairs, you name it, and there's probably a disagreement on it at the moment between most younger people and most older people. And that's partly why there was such stark age divides in support for Labour and the Conservatives at the past two general elections. So with turnout being lower amongst younger people, their preferences are underrepresented in public debate and policy. And this is not a recent phenomenon. I would say, look back at the debates over Brexit, look at welfare reform, increases to pensions since 2010, look at university tuition fees in the 2000s. There's been a pretty consistent skew in policymaking towards older people at the expense of the young. Because voting is habitual, this underrepresentation is likely to continue into the future, and younger people from poorer backgrounds are even more underrepresented. But turnout decline is also bad for British society. It's bad for our democracy. We could see questions about democratic legitimacy being asked in the future if general elections are decided on turnouts below 50%, or decided by electorates that are almost entirely made up of wealthier people or people with degrees, because poorer people are the ones who are highly unlikely to vote. We also know that policymaking is more efficient if more people participate. Basically, if politicians are forced to listen to people from a wider array of age, ethnic, and socioeconomic backgrounds, we know that they get better at responding to society's challenges. So generational turnout decline is a serious thing for young people and older people. The key question of SARB is whether or not volunteering and social action can help. Now, previous research is almost unanimous in saying that it can. Partly, this is because we don't see evidence of this generational decline when it comes to volunteering and social action. The numbers of young people that volunteer is still quite a bit smaller than the numbers that vote in an election. But young people are more likely to volunteer than the majority of their elders. So the same pattern isn't apparent here. And there's a great wealth of research that shows us that volunteering can help develop our social networks. It broadens our social contacts and develops our relationships. It develops our political knowledge. It raises our awareness of community issues, and it can develop our attachment to our neighborhoods and to the people within them. And there's about 50 or 60 years of political science research that shows us that all of those things, as well as having benefits for other things like mental health and happiness and life satisfaction and so on, all of these things are associated with higher turnout. But there's a problem. And the problem that this previous research hasn't been able to overcome is that many of the characteristics associated with volunteering are also associated with voting. The average voter is likely to have a few qualifications, probably a degree increasingly. They're likely to be interested in politics, and they were probably socialized to some extent to take an interest in politics by parents who were themselves politically engaged and probably voted in elections. Those same characteristics describe the average volunteer. So what we don't know is whether volunteering makes people more likely to vote, or are people who volunteer also likely to vote because they were, for example, raised by politically or civically engaged parents. Previous research has been unable to account for these problems, but social action as a route to the ballot box uses the Understanding Society survey, which makes it possible to account for them using a whole host of data and a whole host of statistical techniques, which I'm not going to go into here, don't worry. And what we find when we look at this data, when we take account of these factors, is that on one level, the benefit of volunteering is actually quite limited. It's actually exaggerated in a fair bit of our previous research. I'm going to illustrate this with the next two graphs. So this graph is from Understanding Society data, and it's showing us the proportion of newly eligible voters in the 2015 election who reported voting. Now, the 2015 election, I realise, feels like it took place about a century ago. It was, in social research terms, relatively recent, and we don't yet have the data to do this for the 2017 or the 2019 election. So for now, we're going to stick with 2015. What we've got here is the proportion of people who were eligible to vote for the first time in that election, broken down depending on whether they had volunteered in the years before, in the previous wave of the survey. The red bar are those who didn't, the blue bar are those who volunteered infrequently, and the turquoise bar are those who volunteered at least once a week. And we can see that those who volunteered regularly were the most likely to vote. There was a 12-point difference between their turnout and those who never volunteered, with the guys who volunteered infrequently actually slightly less likely to vote according to this data by a small amount. So there's evidence there of the volunteer effect that we frequently identify in previous research. But now, if we take account of whether or not those same people said that they were interested in politics in their childhood before they volunteered, the pattern takes on a slightly different effect. The two red bars are the people who never volunteered, the two blue bars are those who rarely volunteered, and the turquoise bars are those who volunteered frequently. The solid bars relate to those people who said that they were interested in politics in their childhood, and the dotted bars are those who said that they weren't interested in politics. What we see is that for those who were interested in politics, if they volunteered, they were more likely to vote. There was a 12-point difference in their turnout depending on whether they volunteered frequently or never volunteered at all. But we look at the guys who said that they weren't interested in politics in their childhood, and volunteering had no effect. There's no difference in their turnout. So childhood volunteering does increase turnout a little bit, but what we see is that it is largely benefiting people who probably would have voted anyway. The children who are the most likely to volunteer are already the most likely to vote when they are older. And volunteering doesn't bring us a huge amount of benefit in that regard in terms of making other young people more likely to vote. But there's another section to this story. There's another layer of complexity that we can bring in. It's different if we account for political socialization. That is, if we account for the influence of our respondents' parents. During our childhood, we are particularly susceptible to external influences. Our neighborhoods, our friends, our teachers, our siblings, and above all, our parents. They have an enormous effect on the political values, the attitudes, and the behavioral habits that we develop and that we exhibit throughout our adult lives. A great deal of what we do, even when we're in our 50s and 60s, was implanted within us, or a habit that we developed when we were in our childhood and teenage years. So what we also want to look at in this study is whether or not the characteristics of parents had an effect on whether or not volunteering increased turnout. And in a nutshell, what we found is that it does. Now, there's an awful lot going on this graph. I appreciate that. What this graph is showing is the turnout in 2015 of our newly eligible voters, and they've been broken down depending on whether or not they volunteered The red bars are those who volunteered, the blue bars are those who didn't. And they've all also been broken down depending on whether they were interested in politics as a child and whether their parents were interested in politics. As I said, there's a lot going on, so we're going to focus on two groups. The group on the left are the people that we would expect to be very, very unlikely to volunteer and to vote when they're older, because they weren't interested in politics and community affairs when they were children, and their parents weren't interested either. The group on the far right there, they were interested in politics and community affairs when they were children, and their parents were interested in politics as well. What we see is that the group on the right were far more likely to vote. Regardless of whether they volunteered, their turnout was high. But the group on the far left, the difference in turnout between those who volunteered and those who didn't is far, far larger. Now, this is a small group. Most people are raised by at least one parent who has some interest in politics. But nonetheless, amongst this group, if they volunteered, their turnout was far higher than those who didn't volunteer. Why is this important? Well, what it's showing us is that children who volunteer are far more likely to vote if they otherwise weren't really given much encouragement or support to develop an interest in politics. They weren't raised in a politically active household, and that meant that they didn't have much interest in politics when they were children. If they then volunteered, they became very likely to vote. It's important because politically disengaged households are more likely to be poorer. They're more likely to be financially insecure or residentially insecure, by which I mean the parents are less likely to own their homes, and they're more likely to be in poorer and deprived areas. So the children in that group on the left, raised by disengaged parents, who are themselves uninterested in politics during their childhood, and who are unlikely to volunteer, but who might go on and do it with any luck, these children are disproportionately likely to come from poorer, more financially insecure backgrounds. So volunteering, childhood volunteering, can help us increase turnout if we can get children from these poorer backgrounds to volunteer and take part in social action. In fact, it brings by far the greatest benefit to that particular group. Now, the answers to the two questions that I posed at the beginning here, does childhood volunteering help people vote when they reach adulthood? The answer is yes, but the impact on the whole is relatively small, because most children who volunteer are likely to vote when they're older anyway. The real benefit of volunteering is on that minority of children who aren't likely to vote when they're older. If they volunteer, if they come, for instance, from disengaged households or poorer households, if they are encouraged to volunteer, they become far more likely to vote. So volunteering, social action, policies, funding, and campaigns that can promote those things are an effective way of reducing age and socioeconomic inequalities in turnout. If we really want them to make a difference, we need to get a lot better at getting children from poorer and disengaged backgrounds to volunteer. And to give you an idea of how important it is that we do that, in this sample that I've just showed you, in the respondents that I've just shown you from Understanding Society, if you break the number of young people who said that they volunteered down, depending on whether or not they come from a household in which their parents are interested in politics, or where they own their own homes, or where at least one of those parents is in a professional job or has a degree, you tend to find that about 3/4 of the children who volunteered come from a better off household. About a quarter, and in some cases as few as a fifth, of people who volunteer come from poorer backgrounds. It's the minority of children who volunteer that have by far the most to gain from it. And if we can get more people from those backgrounds to volunteer, we're going to see a tremendous improvement in electoral turnout, but more importantly, we're going to see a real improvement in the representation of young people and young people from poorer backgrounds. Thank you all very much for your patience and for your attention there. And I'm going to hand back to Emma.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Stu. That was really interesting. I'll give people a minute to think of any questions that they have, but we've already got in a couple. There's one from Patrick saying, in your slides you use language like childhood volunteering increases turnout, but I'm not sure that your research methods allow you to make such a strong claim. This language makes it sound like you've identified a causal link, which isn't quite right. I think it's more accurate to say your research shows associations, even though you've got some good control variables and sophisticated form of analysis. Do you agree? And if so, would you mind explaining quickly?
Thanks, Patrick. That is a good question. Yeah, you're right. I'm using causal language. And yes, you're right. Technically, what I've got is an association. I don't have an experimental environment where I can lock some children up and allow some to volunteer and prevent the others from doing it and then see how they vote when they're older. So without that, you're absolutely right. I can't be crystal clear. What I can say is that this research design is more robust than most other research into, most other research that uses data that isn't from understanding society when it comes to looking at the consequences of volunteering, because we're following the same group of children from about the age of 11 right the way up until they became eligible to vote, in this case in the 2015 election. We're following the same group of children. We have a fairly large sample of them, and we're using structural equation modeling and one or two regression techniques to test and retest the significance of the findings that we've got. So you're absolutely right. Technically, this is an association. This is not cast iron proof that children from poorer backgrounds who volunteer get more of an advantage from their volunteering in terms of voting than children from wealthier backgrounds. What it is one of the most reliable forms of social research that you'll get for this, that it is possible to do short of doing something incredibly unethical and locking children up and experimenting on them. But you're absolutely right.
Well, I'm glad that you are not locking children up, Stu. Got a question from Sally. Says, thanks, Stuart. Very interesting and clearly presented. She says, have you been able to look at whether religious affiliation operates independently on either volunteering or voting?
Thanks, Sally. Yes, not in this project, but in a separate project. We looked at whether or not religious affiliation had an effect on volunteering primarily, not so much voting. And we did it while controlling for many of the other traits that we know are typically associated with volunteering, such as being educated or social background and so on. What we tended to find is that the differences are relatively small, but there are certainly some Christian denominations that are more likely to volunteer than others. Presbyterians, most of which are in Scotland, are unusually unlikely to volunteer. Anglicans are in the middle, and Baptists and Methodists stood out for being very likely to volunteer. Whether or not this affects the relationship with voting, we've not been able to identify. It is a good research question, though, and it's one of the things we'd love to do if we could get funding to look at it.
Fab, thank you. There's a comment here that this perhaps highlights the importance of things like school-based volunteering programs, like the Youth Philanthropy Initiative in Scotland, if you're aware of that one. I suppose interested to hear your reflections on that, Stu.
Yeah, I agree. Thanks, Isla. Yeah, I think that it highlights the importance of these policies and of schemes such as the Youth Philanthropy Initiative to help more young people volunteer, or as they're doing in Wales through the Welsh Baccalaureate, volunteering is a compulsory requirement for any student wishing to complete the Welsh Baccalaureate. There is some really good research going on in Wizard that looks at the effect of doing the Welsh Baccalaureate on whether or not people volunteer and how they might feel about that volunteering. So we still don't know whether the effect of volunteering on political engagement varies depending on why you're volunteering or whether you're being compelled to volunteer. But I completely agree with what Isla says, that what this research says to me is that we need to find ways of assessing just how effective some of these programs are to see what their benefits are, because the research suggests that there is a considerable benefit. So we need to pay more attention to them to find out what they are doing and even ways that we might be able to improve them. And on that, I would actually link back to Charlie and Joe's conclusions that getting more young people who are volunteering and are engaging in social action involved with identifying ways of getting younger people who we know are unlikely to do this stuff involved would be a fantastic way forward.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And Raj has made another point based on this around the context in that we've lost quite a lot of the youth infrastructure in less prosperous areas outside of schools, and perhaps we're now more dependent on schools.
Yeah, I think Raj is absolutely right. I think we are more dependent on schools, actually. I think the numbers of facilities that can promote volunteering, and we've got fantastic work being done by things like the Scouts, Girl Guides movement and so on. but they've got less support from government, less encouragement than they used to have. So schools are probably even more important, which might well go back to the point about looking at the effectiveness of the Welsh Baccalaureate's requirements to volunteer.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And we do know, just to plug my own survey from the National Youth Social Action Survey, that schools are the most equitable route into social action for young people. So there's less likely to be a gap between those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds and higher socioeconomic backgrounds when they take part through school. There's a question from Liam here, who has said that he thinks the Understanding Society survey includes what types of volunteering took place, although that might be wrong. Did you undertake any regressions on this that suggested a particular type of volunteering was more effective at reducing the voting gap for more disadvantaged young people?
That's a fantastic question, Liam. You're preempting my next research project. Understanding Society doesn't ask about the type of volunteering. It does ask questions on membership of particular types of associations. So that could give us some clues about the type of volunteering that's taking place. But it doesn't ask about the difference between, say, someone who volunteers by raising money and someone who volunteers by helping out at a food bank, or someone who volunteers by chairing a committee. That's the next thing that I want to do, because previous research shows that there are quite dramatic differences in the effectiveness of volunteering, depending on what it is exactly that volunteers are doing. So a superb research project that I would love to do is to actually look at the effectiveness of different forms of volunteering. For that, we need more research funding, and anyone that's followed my project or indeed read the summary of the project that I sent out in a previous email will see that I'm asking for anyone who's interested in that and who wants to support it to let me know, because funding bodies are far more likely to look positively on a request for a few £100,000 if it's supported by people actually in the real world rather than the ivory tower of academia to do this.
Great, thanks. Got a comment from Sophia. Hi, Sophia. Sophia's an iwill ambassador as well, saying that she definitely agrees with Raj's point that schools are having to plug the gaps left due to the lack of investment in VTS, specifically regards to young people. Thanks for that comment, Sophia. Kimberly's asking that you've mentioned that there is data on membership of groups. Have you done any work on this, and whether there's a difference between social action through an organisation like Scouts through school or individual activism, or perhaps this will come through in the next phase of research?
Yeah, it does. Thanks, Kimberly. It's essentially something I would look at in the next phase of research. But one of the problems with the measures of associational membership in Understanding Society is that the number of people who ever say that they are the member of something like the Scouts or an environmental group is invariably far smaller than the number who say that they volunteer. And so we do end up with some problems that the sample size that we need to use for our statistical analysis basically just shrinks and shrinks and shrinks when we look at some of these measures. There are some ways around it. It's something I'm exploring for the next stage of the research, but for now, I've just stuck with the measure of whether or not someone says that they have volunteered.
Fantastic, thank you. And with that, I'm going to draw us to a close. I'm just going to mention this comment that Sophia's made as a nice positive, and he said, as a food bank volunteer myself, I can honestly say it's completely changed my life and given me an entirely new perspective on everything. I wish every young person was actively encouraged and supported to volunteer, not just in a tokenistic way, which is lovely. Thank you, Sophia. I would like to say a huge thank you to Dr. Stuart Fox, to Charlie and to Joe, our iwill ambassadors, for presenting today. If you do have any questions, you would like to follow up with them, please do get in contact with me and I will put you in touch. We'll try and make our way through the other questions that we didn't manage to get round to today. But thank you everyone for joining.